Hey, everybody. It's Alyssa Miller. How are you guys doing? You have made it through 2 days of CircleCityCon. It's been a lot of good stuff. I hope you're really enjoying it. Here we sit now. We're in the final run here, I guess, of today's events. So glad to see you all here. So glad you could be with us. Thank you for joining me. Let's dive in. I don't even want to wait because we're getting happy. We're going to be super happy. We're making DevSecOps actually work in our environments, in our organizations, wherever it is that we're developing software. But before we begin, just in case you don't know who I am, let me introduce myself. So like I said, I'm Alyssa Miller. First and foremost, I'm a hacker, a researcher, and a security advocate. Now, what do I mean by security advocate? Means I like to get out and do stuff just like I'm doing right now. Talk to all of you, share some ideas, talk about problems that we face in security, hear what you're thinking, tell you what I'm thinking or what I found in my research, and see what we can do to get better. That's what it's all about. I am also a BISO. What does that mean? Well, we'll talk about that in a second, but I'm a BISO for S&P Global Ratings. So if you've heard of Standard & Poor, yeah, that's that S&P. So maybe like the S&P 500, you might be familiar with that as well. That's who we are. Now, I said, what is a BISO? Business Information Security Officer. I'm not going to go into details right now, but if you want, there's a link. I wrote a blog on it when I got the job because I knew people were going to ask, Alyssa, you got this job as a BISO. What the heck is that? So check it out if you're interested. Otherwise, just know it's Business Information Security Officer. I lead the security strategy for S&P Global Ratings. Now, my history in tech, I've been a lot of places. 10 years as a developer. That's how I got started. And then I spent the last 16 years in security. I pivoted from a development job into a pen testing job. I then became a consultant for a while, and ultimately now I find myself at S&P. And then finally, I'm an author, a blogger, a podcaster. I kind of try to do a lot of different things. Again, just ways that I can interact with our community and really exchange ideas. And just, again, it's all about trying to make us better. So that's it. That's enough about me. You have heard enough. Let me tell you about a few other really important people that are going to be a part of today's discussion. No, they're not here with me, but it's important that you know the history. So we're talking DevSecOps. How many of you actually know the history of where DevOps and DevSecOps came from? Not everybody does, so let me give you a quick history lesson. So I'm going to rewind you all the way back to the year 2008. God, I can't believe that's actually 13 years ago. Wow. Some of you might not have even been working in like full-time jobs yet by then. And that's great. I love it. I'm glad we got new faces, but that's why I'm going to tell you this story. So in 2008, this gentleman, his name is Patrick Dubois. He lives in Belgium. And he was a software developer, among other things. And he was really frustrated with just the difficulty that his development teams had getting software from, the conceptual stage and getting it written and built and tested all the way through to deployment. And he was looking for a way to make this easier. How could he reduce the friction between his dev teams and the operational teams that he had to work with, who were ultimately the ones he had to satisfy in order to get his software to production? But he wasn't the only one thinking this. This is Andrew Schaefer. Andrew Schaefer was thinking some of the same things back in 2008. In fact, I don't recall the name of the conference, but at a conference they were both going to, Andrew Schaefer put out an idea for a birds of a feather session, where you get a few people together and you talk about some idea. And Patrick saw this and he thought it was great. He's like, okay, great. I'm going to go to this. So Patrick signed up. Well, Patrick was the only one who signed up. And in fact, he was the only one who showed up because Andrew didn't show up because there was only one person. And so long story short, they ended up meeting later and they got to talking about this idea of how they would unite developers and operations together, break down the walls, make everything happy for everybody so we could deploy software a whole lot faster. And from that idea, they spawned DevSecOps Days, or DevOps Days, which is the first time that we know of that term being used, DevOps. And it was just this idea of we can make software delivery so much faster if we just break down all these barriers. But who's missing from this conversation? You see, this was 2009 and we started having conferences about this. It wasn't until 2012 that security started to realize, like, okay, this is a real movement we got to do something about. Organizations were starting to adopt it. Amazon was doing millions of deployments, every year. Everybody was jumping on this idea of a DevOps bandwagon. So two gentlemen, Josh Corman and Gene Kim, in 2012, gave what is kind of their now pretty infamous talk, Security is Dead, Long Live Rugged DevOps. And the whole idea was, if we're going to do this DevOps thing and we're going to be super fast, and I know they cited that, like, I think at that point, Amazon was averaging deployments every 11 seconds in their DevOps pipeline. These guys were like, look, if we're going to do this, we got to think about security all differently. So we are going to jump in, and they talked about this idea of rugged DevOps, where software didn't just get built secure, but it had to be built ruggedly. And you can go find that talk. It's definitely still online. I encourage you to check it out sometime. But we're now in the year 2021, and we still, as security people, seem to struggle with this. And some of the conversation begins with just who is ultimately responsible for security. So prior to my current role, I worked for a company called Sneak. And last year, we did our State of Open Source Security report. I went into a lot of research on a lot of different topics, but one of the things we did was we had a survey, and we surveyed literally thousands of people about, how security, open source, DevSecOps, how all that looked in their organization. So one of the questions I asked, and it was a follow-up to what we had asked in the previous year, was, who's responsible for the security of your software and your infrastructure? And what you see here is kind of some interesting results. Now, they could answer that question with multiple answers. So they could choose all three. They could have chosen all four, or all five, which would have been a little weird. But you see here that like 85% said devs are responsible for the security of the software, but only 55% thought security was involved in that, and only 35% thought operations. When it came to infrastructure, it leveled off a lot more. You can see the impacts that infrastructure as code and cloud native technologies are having here, because now suddenly devs aren't as responsible. Operations predictably came up quite a bit, and security still sat there. Only half of them thought security played a part in securing the infrastructure. So these are really interesting attitudes that we're seeing, and it makes it really complex when we want to bring security to the DevOps discussion, because no one really wants to say who's responsible for security. But that's not the only problem. DevOps has created a whole gamut of new technologies and new approaches to things that we didn't have back when I was a software developer 16 years ago. And so there's a lot of issues, and a lot of them start with just knowing what's in your software. Modern day development is more complex than it's ever been before, because we've added all of these things to ultimately make it faster. I know that seems odd. More complex development means faster development. Alyssa, you've lost your mind. I promise you, it does actually make sense. But we've created a lot of technologies, and maybe you're familiar with this question here. What is in your software? Think about, if you remember that breach in 2017, Equifax, where apparently, and we'll never really know for sure, but apparently they had some open source struts libraries that had known vulnerabilities. They didn't know that they were there, and they got compromised. This is the challenge we have. Now, where does it come from? Well, it's how we write our code. So back in my day, God, do I sound old when I say that? Back when I was a software developer, that sounds a little better. If you had an application that was 100,000 lines of code, it meant that developers in your organization wrote 100,000 lines of code. But it's not that way anymore. You see, the open source community, cloud native, have all become involved in our development in an effort to make things faster. As we've got DevOps developers working to quickly construct code and deploy it, we've created this open source community that is wonderful. And it means that I don't have to write 100,000 lines of code, because a lot of the functionality I may need, I go grab from the open source community. And I just do that in the form of dependencies that I introduce into my software. So here's a great example. This is a Java application, all right? And this is you're seeing the manifest here. Now, this Java application is only 280 lines of code that this developer wrote. Great, okay, super simple app, right? Seems really simple. Yeah, but they introduce 8 dependencies through the manifest. Okay, so I've got 8 packages of software that I'm going to go pull from the open source community that are going to now be a part of my software. All right, not the end of the world. The only problem is each of those dependencies, each package that I introduce has its own dependencies, 89 sub-dependencies, and suddenly my 280 lines of code is turned into 2.4 million lines of code that I'm responsible for as a developer, that I'm responsible for as a security practitioner trying to secure my applications. Do you see the problem now? This is the challenge that DevOps has brought to us from just a software development perspective, where we've gotten faster and faster and faster. We've introduced this idea of dependencies. And if you're a Node.js developer in particular, if you're working with NPM, you know the story. You go in, you open up your project, you go get some coffee while you wait for NPM to reload all your dependencies. That's what software development's like these days. But it's not just software developers. What about our ops teams? I love this quote from Kelsey Hightower. It's a great tweet he put out a while back. I've latched onto it. I'm never letting it go. He says, so you want to roll your own application platform? Well, great. All you need to know is you need to know Linux and Docker and Kubernetes and Istio and Prometheus and FluentD and Grafana and Jaeger and Harbor. And oh my God, are you kidding me? This is what we expect our ops teams to be able to deal with. This is cloud native world. Hey, great, DevOps, cloud native. We're going full bore straight ahead. Ooh, we've got our ops and our devs teams working together. They're really excited. But oh my God, look at what we're asking of them. When we talk cloud native, have you seen this yet? This is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's cloud native landscape. Now, this is actually a few months old, so it's probably even worse than this now. These are all the technologies that go into building a cloud native environment. Holy crap. I've made this as big as I can, and you can't even read the names on most of these. You might recognize some of the logos. These are all the things that our devs and our ops teams need to be experts in. They need to understand how to configure all these. And so when we say that they're responsible for security, we want them to be able to secure all these things. How in the heck are they going to do that? It's just not feasible. So, okay, great. That's why we have security teams, right? Security to the rescue. We're going to hop in because security is going to come in and we're going to do that AppSec thing. Sure, we'll get to that AppSec thing right after we're done worrying about perimeter security and network security. Yeah, well, by the way, endpoint security, because we got to worry about all those people who got laptops and desktops on our network. We got to think about policy management. We got to build all the policies that are going to govern all this. We got to think about operations. And then maybe we can get to application security. But application security also, of course, brings with it data security. Are you exhausted yet listening to me? Because I'm exhausted talking about this. This is crazy stuff. This is everything that falls under our security umbrella. And if you work in security or you've talked to anybody in security, you know that we all have unlimited budgets to do all this, right? No, we don't. We have limited resources. We have limited budgets, just the same as everybody else. So trying to manage all of this is so complex for the security team, but that's okay. I have an answer. We have tools, lots and lots of tools. All the security products are going to make us better. They're going to help secure us. God, this looks just like that cloud native, doesn't it? It's the same thing. Lots and lots of technologies that we have to understand. We got to understand infrastructure security, endpoint security, application security, messaging security, web security, security operations and incident response, risk and compliance, threat intelligence, mobile security. Oh God, I'm stopping. I'm losing my breath. What are we doing here? Nobody can know all these things, right? So if we're saying that you have to have all of these tools to make your software more secure and to defend your environments, is it any wonder we're still seeing more and more breaches every single year? No, it's not. And we in security are responsible for many of the problems that we have. Now, when it comes to application security, and specifically when I'm talking DevOps, and how do we bring the security conversation to DevOps? I have been to easily 20 or more talks at various conferences over the last 3 years talking about DevSecOps. Now remember, DevSecOps, we started talking about this in 2012. Josh Corman, Gene Kim, thank you guys. I'm still hearing talks, 20 of them in 3 years that I went to. And what I noticed is none of them seem to, in my opinion, at least get it. And so I started really sitting down and listening. I went back through a lot of these talks that I had heard, and I went out and I looked up some others that I could find online. And I wanted to see, what's the message here? What aren't we doing from a security perspective? Is it the message that's wrong, or are we just not implementing it? And what I found was there's a lot of myths that we perpetrate as security practitioners when it comes to DevSecOps. Things that we say you got to do, things that we say are absolutely necessary, attitudes that we have, ways that we approach this that are just plain dead wrong. You almost got me to drop an F-bomb there, but I caught myself. Going to be good today. I know it's CircleCityCon, but I still must behave. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, what we're diving into next, I'm going to talk to you about 5 of the myths, 5 themes that I saw in these talks, or that I've heard from security practitioners, even within my own organizations. Things that I've heard as a consultant that companies were talking about that they thought they had to do to make DevSecOps work. This is where I want to start to break down these myths. It starts with you today. We're going to start to do DevSecOps better, and it starts now. Myth number 1. Tool automation is how you achieve DevSecOps. How many times have you heard it? Oh, DevSecOps, we're moving really fast. Companies like Amazon are deploying every 11 seconds. This means we need to get all the security tools and they must all integrate and be automated in our pipeline. And that's how we're going to make DevSecOps happen. Is that what DevOps was? Think back a minute. What did I tell you that, as those guys back in 2008, 2009, 2012 were putting this together? Were they talking tools? No. Patrick Dubois, Andrew Schaefer, when they got together, it wasn't about how do we get better tools. It was how do we get groups of people working together. Ultimately, what they wanted was a culture. Ooh, there's an evil term. We hate when we talk about culture. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Because it's hard to do. Culture's tough. How do I build a culture? That's hard. But that's the reality. When we're talking DevOps, or more importantly now DevSecOps, we are talking about building a culture. That means we cannot focus on tools. And yet that's what we always do. Want proof? I went out to Google and I checked search stats. In searches that included the term DevSecOps, what did I find? Number 1 was DevSecOps, just that was the search. Number 2, I think, was DevSecOps. And then I don't even remember what the other word, but it was not inconsequential. Number 3 was tools. So DevSecOps tools was the number 3 most searched term, including DevSecOps. DevSecOps practices didn't show up until number 9. Methodology was 10, excuse me. So now we're at the bottom of that first page of results from Google. Thank you. DevSecOps roles, the people side of this, was number 12. And DevSecOps culture didn't show up until number 14. So we're halfway through the second page of results. Think about this. If I want to build a culture, it's not just about tools and technology. It's about the people. It's about the processes and that evil G word, governance. Oh, everybody hates governance because governance is yuck. It's policy. It's audits. It's all this yucky stuff. How are you going to build a meaningful culture and know if it's working if you don't have governance? If you're not monitoring your metrics, seeing what works? I referenced this stat over and over again already from Gene and Josh's talk about Amazon deploying every 11 seconds. How does Amazon know that? Because they have meaningful metrics and they have governance that says, we're going to make sure that people are following what our processes are. They're following our standards. They're doing the things. They're using the tooling. And we're going to make sure that we know what's working and what isn't so we can continue to get better. That's how you build a culture. Now, why is this culture so important? the motion of today's DevSecOps pipeline is very conflicting. With this new world in particular of cloud native, which always seems to come along with the DevSecOps discussion, we've got these conflicting motions. We've got security who's trying to push left. God love us, as long as I've been in security, we have been talking about the need to push left. 16 years. In fact, we were talking about it when I was a developer. We were talking about pushing left, not just in terms of security, but also our testing. We wanted QA to push left. How do we do this testing sooner? But now we've introduced cloud native, and the influence of developers is pushing further to the right. Developers now, through things like infrastructure as code, are defining the very infrastructure on which they're going to deploy their software. So their influence moves farther and farther right into the pipeline. But then you've got ops. Ops is having to push up the stack, right? Because ops can no longer worry about just bare metal servers and operating systems. They need to understand things like Kubernetes and the database layer, and they need to be a part of creating containers. All this is defined in code. They're working in things like Terraform. But oh my gosh, this isn't just about plugging blades into server racks and things like that. This is we're writing code as operations folks. This is where the SRE role has come from. And then finally pushing down into granular levels of involvement in the pipeline is our business. We've got business people writing user stories. They're putting new information on our backlogs all the time. They are directly defining our sprints many times. They're typically at least involved in our sprint planning if we do that. If we're true CICD, maybe they don't even have planning. And so they're there as part of helping prioritize various user stories. So we have all these conflicting motions, and this is why culture is so important, because having a culture around DevSecOps is what's going to allow us to align these various motions together and coordinate them and make them happen. And that feeds right into our second myth. The second myth that I always hear when I go and talk to security people about DevSecOps is that shared responsibility means everyone's responsible for security. Have you heard this term shared responsibility before? This is talked about a lot when we talk DevOps and DevSecOps. It's this idea that everybody has a shared responsibility for getting software out. And that's the key, because when I say shared responsibility means everyone's responsible for security, well, what are my devs and my SREs saying? They're asking, what the hell about us? What about all those times you told us security? You said you had the answers to make this right, and you're still telling us we're not secure. DevSecOps, shared responsibility, this shared responsibility, which is at the core of DevSecOps culture, is not just about security. How arrogant are we as security practitioners that we want to go in there and say, it's a shared responsibility, you all must do security. It's not just about security. What about us as security practitioners? How do we take on a shared responsibility? Now, I promise you, this is one of very few times, and it is the only time in this presentation that you will see a Venn diagram from me. I hate these things, but I had to use it. It was the only way that I could really think of that I could illustrate this next point. Shared responsibility is everybody is responsible for the pipeline, the deployment of software. That means all of our goals have to align. So let's talk about those goals for a minute. You have developers. What are the developers' motivations? What are they trying to do? They're trying to deploy fast, and they're trying to minimize works in progress. If you work in a development organization, maybe you've seen the Kanban boards that our development teams use to manage this. They know what's in the backlog. They know what's a work in progress. They know what's done, what's been deployed. And that work in progress column is always the one that we're trying to minimize. We don't want things sitting in work in progress any longer than we have to. The key to getting to a quick CICD, we're continuously deploying new software at that 11 seconds mark. It's about reducing work in progress, moving things through the pipeline quickly. Now for ops, what they're worried about is uptime and responsiveness. If things are running slow or servers are down or containers are failing or our Kubernetes clusters are having problems. That's their world. That's what they're worried about. All that infrastructure stuff. When it comes to software, they are worried about, is it available and is it running efficiently? And then security, of course, we're looking to eliminate vulnerabilities and defend our systems. We want to get rid of the risk. We want to make sure we don't get hacked. So we are working on this. But when I talk shared responsibility in DevSecOps, this is where it happens. It's when those intersect. When my security team understands that security is responsible for deploying fast and minimizing works in progress. Security is responsible for uptime and responsiveness. Same thing for ops. They're responsible for deploying fast and minimizing works in progress, as well as eliminating vulnerabilities and defending systems. And our devs understand that they are responsible for eliminating vulnerabilities and defending systems and making sure that their software is up as often as much as possible and that it's responsive. Everybody has these in their goals. That is the shared responsibility that we're talking about when we talk about DevSecOps. So we need to be building this into our culture, this understanding that everybody is not only responsible for security, everybody is responsible for making that pipeline as efficient as possible. And everybody is responsible for making sure that the software in our production environments runs as efficiently as possible and that it is always available, at least to whatever service level it is that we are shooting for. That's shared responsibility. Ooh, this is sounding fun, isn't it? But we're not done yet. That's only the second myth. I got more. We're busting myths left and right. Myth number 3. Build gates into the pipeline to achieve security in DevSecOps. Those of you that know me and follow me on Twitter or have talked to me in any way about software development and DevSecOps, you know this is probably my single biggest pet peeve. The story, the narrative that in order to do DevSecOps, in order to bring security into DevOps, we need to put gates in the pipeline where we do the security thing, where we validate the security of the software. Reality is, we've been doing this forever. When I go to these, and we haven't changed, right? When I go to these talks, this is what people suggest. They suggest that, well, you know, when something moves from the backlog to the point where, to the coding phase, well, you need to do your threat modeling then. And then when you're ready, when that code gets committed, well, now we need to do our SAST and DAST tools. And then before we can deploy, after we built and tested it, well, now we need to do our DAST tools. And then after it's deployed, we got to do penetration testing. This creates friction. These create long feedback loops that slow down our pipeline. More on that in a minute. We need to think in terms of frictionless enablement when it comes to DevSecOps. How does security frictionlessly enable the pipeline to flow? Remember, security is responsible for, you know, fast deploys and reducing works in progress. That's our responsibility now. So we have to be all about frictionless enablement. To do that, we need to make our security practices part of those phases. They cannot be gates in between. Let's talk a little bit more about this. Now, when I hear people talk about gates in the pipeline, usually what they're talking about is breaking the build. You'll hear this discussed a lot of times in conversations about DevSecOps. So how does that work? Well, I've got developers who are constantly developing. They're writing their code, they're committing their code. They're writing more code, they're committing more code. And at some point, that code is going to get promoted. When that code gets promoted, it gets built. And when that code gets built, it gets tested. And this is all automated as well, right? This is where the CI portion of our pipeline starts, that continuous integration. And then from there, it's going to reach that point, our testing is done. And the last piece is then now we're ready to move to release. We're going to promote again, but now we have to test it again. This is where we do our regression tests. And now we package it up and we deploy it. So where does security fit? We put in gates. We want to break the build. So what do we say? We say that, yes, we test as part of your build. So after your software builds, we run our security tests in an automated fashion. Maybe it's source code analysis, our SAST tools. Maybe we do source code or source code analysis or software composition analysis, SCA. And what do? Oh, you have too many vulnerabilities, or you have too many critical or severe or high vulnerabilities. You have packages that have vulnerabilities and need to be updated. We're going to push the pipeline backward and you're going back to development. What happens when we go to release? Same thing. We launch testing. We test their packages. Oh, sorry, this doesn't match up to our expectations. We're going to break it. We're putting that gate in. That gate stays closed. You can't go to production. We're sending you all the way back to development. This breaks CICD. This breaks the whole concept of DevSecOps. So how do we get to a true CICD? Well, we've got our developers doing what they do. We want them coding and committing all day. That's what we want them doing, constantly coding and committing, putting new code into the repository, keep building up our packages. Integration still looks the same. We build and then we test. So somewhere in this process, we've got those, we're doing various testing. That's great. And then our release, package it up, test it, and deploy it. Great. The key here is we need to enable these developers differently. When I talk frictionless enablement, I'm talking about giving the developers the ability to do much of the security work before anything gets built, before it moves into that testing phase, so that when we get to the testing phase, vulnerabilities we're finding are not so critical that we have to break a build. Instead, we're moving toward the point where our vulnerabilities are low enough severity that I can just throw them in the backlog with a high priority, and they just get addressed in the next cycle. Another key to this is the speed. So when security is focused on making our CI/CD flow quickly, on deploying fast, I know that because I'm deploying on average every 11 seconds, that it's not going to take long for that P1 security vulnerability that just got put into the backlog to get fixed. So if that security vulnerability goes through and is deployed to production, I know very quickly it will be addressed by our developers because there's a P1 user story out there that's going to get grabbed next. And I can do the same thing with the testing that happens pre-deployment. This is our goal. This should be our goal as security practitioners working in application security. When we're working in DevSecOps with a CI/CD pipeline, we don't want to push that pipeline backward. We need to keep it flowing and make it faster and faster, because that is what is going to give us rugged DevOps. We become rugged when those things get fixed quickly and we continue to improve the software at a high rate of speed. That's where we need to go as security practitioners. It's not about building gates and stopping that pipeline. It's about enabling our developers to move faster, to do this quicker, and to understand the security concepts that we want them to be aware of, that we want them to incorporate into their code, and giving them tools to do it. How many of your developers have SaaS tools, SCA tools that run within their IDEs, that run on their repos when they commit code? Those packages are there, that tooling is there, that's one piece of it. Training them, giving them that awareness, working with them, and enabling them with things like reference architectures, design standards, things that they can reference back to and quickly address the security needs of the user story they're working on. And this brings us to our next myth. Myth number 4 is that threat modeling is incompatible with DevSecOps. I was told this once. I was working as a consultant and I worked with this organization who had a very well-defined threat modeling process. It was great. I mean, they had spent years building it. They went through it. They had it down to where they could do this. They called it, I don't even remember, it wasn't architecture review, but it was like security architecture review or something like that. It's not important, but basically it was threat modeling. And they had it down to where they could do it within a day. They could bring everybody together. They had certain artifacts that had to be created in advance, but everybody got together on one day and they did this thing. And I remember coming out of one of these sessions and talking to a developer who told me he was so excited, he couldn't wait until they didn't have to do this anymore because they were going to a DevSecOps model. And you can't do threat modeling if you're in DevSecOps. Wrong, 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 wrong. If you saw my talk yesterday on threat modeling, you know I hit this and we're about to talk about it again. I promised you yesterday I would get in deeper into this discussion. So if you saw that talk, you saw this. For those of you that didn't, 2019, CircleCI and Puppet released their State of DevOps report. In that report, they analyzed a lot of different things about DevOps culture and so forth. But one of the things they looked at was security practices in the DevOps community. They looked at the frequency with which we practice certain security tasks versus the importance or the impact that they have on the security posture of the software. And they plotted it out in 4 quadrants. This upper left quadrant, those things that we do a lot that don't necessarily have the impact we would want on security posture. That's where we see things, and I know it's hard to read, but you see things like penetration testing, dependency checkers, static code analysis, security requirements. But it's when we go down here to the lower right, those things that we don't do very often, they're not as well adopted, but have significant impact. We see this one that's circled. It says security and dev teams collaborating on threat models. This is how important threat modeling is. Threat modeling has such a massive impact on the security posture of our software. And it's one of those things that allows us to push further left. But when I say threat modeling, people start to think of this. And you probably do too if you've done any threat modeling. You see that data flow diagram up there, and you think about, oh yeah, for threat modeling, we have to put together this whole data flow diagram that maps out data throughout our entire system, where it flows, where it's stored, where it's processed, the trust boundaries that it crosses. And we got to know the whole system. So that requires us to have a big, heavy design session to make that happen, doesn't it? Well, no wonder we don't think it's compatible with DevSecOps. And then, by the way, after we've done that, we're going to use Stride, this framework that we use to classify threat models. Here's how we're going to classify our threats. And we're going to use really technical terminology from the security world. We're going to talk about spoofing and tampering and repudiation and integrity. What? No one understands that. Come on, we're the only ones who get that. But then we're going to take them, we're going to create attack trees. So there's another process. We have to map out all the threats and how they turn into attack trees to realize those threats. And we're going to realize that some of those attack patterns are impossible. So we're going to scratch those off now. That's a lot of wasted effort. Oh, and then we're going to use dread, because now that we've got our threats and our attacks mapped out, well, we got to prioritize them. So we are going to use dread as a framework to help us do that. And then we're going to do this in the cyclical fashion. We're going to have to do this over and over again. So that's all complex. So then we're going to create this thing called the CAPEC taxonomy, because that's going to make everything easier. Does that look easy to you? Doesn't to me. This is why people don't think DevSecOps and threat modeling can possibly go together. But I said that's a myth. And it is, because we can do this so much differently. We need to think a little bit differently. Go back to the basics of threat modeling for a minute. And I know I've got a colleague of mine, she's probably disappointed because I don't have the slide in this particular deck. You saw it yesterday. This is the infamous Timmy Turner attitude. Threat modeling, all it really is asking what could possibly go wrong. That's it. We don't need all these frameworks and things. We don't need all this information. We don't need big design cycles. All we need to do is, in plain language, define what are our critical assets and what could possibly go wrong with them. Now, we also want to push left. How much further left can you possibly push than the user story? That's where it begins. It all starts at the user story. So if we can push security practices left to the user story, we've gone as far left as we could possibly imagine. And that's exactly where we need to go. So think about this. If threat modeling is just simply asking what could possibly go wrong, you do that every day. Every one of us does. If you're, my favorite example is you live in the suburbs and you're going to go to the city for a show. What are you going to think about? You're going to probably think about, well, where am I going to find parking close enough to the show? How much is it going to cost me? What happens if the car has issues on the way down? I get a flat tire, whatever. Is the area I'm going to and where I'm going to park well lit and safe? What's the crime like in that area? Is this an okay place to go? What time do I leave so I get there on time? These are all threats. You're threat modeling in your head and you're thinking about what am I going to do about that? So we want our business people who write our user stories to do the same. Tell us what's important to you in this, just the scope of this user story. What critical assets are introduced or being modified? Is it personal information? Is it critical functions that need to be available at all times? Is it, financial assets or trade secrets? And then tell us what the threats are. Is there a threat that they could be stolen? So there's a threat of theft. Is there a possibility of fraud? What are the key threats that you're worried about? And just put it in plain language. Because now this feeds the rest of our pipeline, and I'm going to show you how. This starts to progress us toward making that pipeline faster, and it shows our teams how security can make them faster and more efficient. So I've got this threat information in my backlog. It's in my user story. I go and I pull that user story, maybe as part of sprint planning, or I'm just a dev who's in a really, really fast-paced CICD, and I just pull the next highest priority item off of the backlog. I look at that threat information either way, and I can say, I understand my security requirements because they've told me what's important here and they've told me the threats. So now as I move into coding, I can build security controls. I can reference back, if we're really mature, I can reference back to reference architectures or design standards, engineering standards, those things that help our developers be more enabled to create these security controls. But it doesn't stop there. Because I have this information and now I know what security controls I've prioritized and created, well, that can feed my test cases. Because now I know what's most important from a security perspective, so I can feed that into my automated test cases. And then because that information is there, when I move to deployment, my SREs, my ops teams, everybody who's responsible for that piece of it, they understand how to configure the monitoring to watch for those potential threats. This is how threat modeling can fit in here. And this is how threat modeling can be used to make your pipeline faster. Reduce works in progress, deploy quicker, because security, you're responsible for it. So this is how you get there. Use threat modeling. Not only is it not incompatible, it's necessary and it's a huge asset to you. So let's do this. Now, if you want to know more, again, go to my talk from yesterday. See that talk, Pasta Octave Stride Oh My. And I'll give you more pointers in that one on how you do this. Last myth number 5. You guys almost made it. We're almost there. One more myth I need you security people to stop putting out there. And that is this idea that we need to break down the silos in order to build DevSecOps culture. Silos exist for a reason. Because we need people who specialize in certain knowledge. When I say shared responsibility, that doesn't mean that I want my security people to be in there configuring databases, configuring, Kubernetes clusters, things of that nature. I don't want my ops writing application code. I want everybody to have an understanding and to do their part, but we still want those areas of expertise. We don't want to break down silos. We need to network those silos. We want them to talk and work together productively, build up Scrum teams. Well, let's dive into that. Let's talk about this before I get ahead of myself. Building that empathy and culture is how we network these silos together. Empathy is one of the things that I think is so underrated, but I'm glad I'm hearing more and more people talk about the need for it in security. We need it in DevSecOps because it's how we make all this work. It's how we network across silos and make sure that instead of breaking down silos, we make the silos work together in concert with each other. One of the ways you can do this is this idea of walking a mile in their shoes, job shadowing. Get dev and sec and ops spending time working in each other's roles And don't just use your junior devs. Don't just use your junior security analysts. Send the senior folks. I know it's tough because they're very productive and you don't want to give up that productivity. But they're the ones who will have the best perspective to bring that back to the team. And this is all about building that empathy where now they understand what the people in security, what the people in ops are dealing with as a result of what comes to them from the development side. And now they can start to shape that. They start interfacing with those people on a daily basis and it humanizes each other. And now they interact better. From a security perspective, if we're going to talk about new processes, new tools, anything, we have got to meet them where they live. Provide resources and tooling that fit in the pipeline. This is knowledge, this is processes, this is tooling, it's all of it. Make sure that if you're going to introduce a new piece of security tooling, maybe you're launching a new SCA platform or some new cloud security product, how does that tie into their pipeline? Can it be automated? Can their build scripts automate that? Can the results be automated into new entries in the backlog? How do we make this happen? Make sure everything plugs in to their existing tooling. This is how we eliminate friction. So, while automation isn't the only part of DevSecOps, it is still part of those 5 areas we talked about to building that culture. So make sure you meet them where they live. Give them tools that are familiar to them, things that plug into their IDE so they don't have to learn a new way of doing their job. They don't have to add additional complexity to the things that they're doing so that they can continue to improve the speed and reduce works in progress. Then it's about paving the road. So as you're building this, as you're looking at it in terms of tool selection, you're throwing it out there, you're enabling your developers. Now comes that idea of accountable trust. How many of us deal with security teams who are overwhelmed with work? We can't keep up with all of the demands of, trying to review all the software that comes our way from our development teams. Make them accountable. Trust them to do the right thing. Trust them to see that if there is a better way, they can accomplish the same objective in that other way and enable them to do that. You trust them, but you trust them because you've built a culture where they understand that they're accountable. This takes time, it takes effort, and security still needs some level of oversight. But at the end of the day, this is how we get better because we can't keep up. We don't have those unlimited budgets. It just doesn't happen. Pave the road, put the path, make it so that the secure way to get there is the easiest way to get there. But then if you're wrong, enable them to change that path and pave their own road. And then finally, mutual engagement. When we're talking about empathy, this is huge. How many of you invite your SREs and your security team to your scrums, to your daily stand-ups, to your sprint planning, to your retrospectives? Do they come to your risk committee meetings, your devs and your ops teams? They should. You should all be interacting on a daily basis. When these daily activities include everybody, this builds that idea of shared responsibility where everybody understands that while they bring their own expertise and perspectives, they're ultimately all responsible for the same thing. That's how you get to a DevSecOps culture. You need to get everybody into that mode of we work together for the same objectives. Creating that mutual engagement drives that culture. It builds that empathy. And again, it humanizes each other where we understand the challenges and we don't just make assumptions when we see something we don't like that it's because somebody was being lazy. So it's just about time for me to wrap up here. But as I usually do, I want to leave you with a quote. And this one comes from Henry Ford. Coming together is the beginning, creating an organization of lots of different people. Keeping together is progress. So establishing those processes and things that we all work within. But working together The shared responsibility is where we find success. That is the key to DevSecOps. That is the vision that Patrick and Andrew and Gene and Josh laid out for us so many years ago, that we need to keep driving for security practitioners. We need to understand how we, in security, need to be just as responsible as our developers and as our operations teams, and we can make this work. So, did I get it wrong? Am I completely out of my gourd? Do you want to nitpick something I said and I didn't quite get it right? Let me know. Interact with me. Here's my social media information. Twitter is by far the easiest way. You've got my LinkedIn information there as well. My website, you can contact me through there. Find out where I'm speaking next. If you want to catch me at a real life conference, since we're starting to get back to those now, come talk to me. Share your ideas, criticize what I've said, challenge me. Let's all get better at this. So finally, as I'm wrapping up, big thank you. Thank you, CircleCityCon. It has been my honor to be able to present here today and yesterday too. Thank you, S&P Ratings, for making it possible for me to be here to share some of the experiences that I've developed just working through that organization. But most importantly, thank all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your support, not only of me, not only of this conference, but the whole idea of making our security community better. I love you all. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Take care.